Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the N1 Fitness Podcast. I'm super stoked to have a guy that I've learned a ton from over the years. Lennon's on the show. He's got a bachelor's degree in biology and physics, as well as a master's in nutritional sciences from the University College Cork. He's the founder of Sigma Nutrition Radio, where he works as a performance nutritionist. And lots of you probably know him best from his super popular podcast, Sigma Nutrition Radio. I've listened to just about every episode. I think there's over 200 of them. So that's saying something. And then just as a side note, Danny is one of my favorite people in the fitness industry. So I'm super excited to have him on and to drop some knowledge on us. So Danny, welcome.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the kind words. And I just feel a bit sorry the fact that you've maybe listened over the 200 hours of my voice that you have to listen to another one. But I appreciate the kind words. And I'm really excited to be here. So thanks so much for asking me, man.
Yeah, man. Stoked to have you on. So just to kind of start out here, can you give the listeners some insight on how you got into the whole fitness game and got interested in this stuff to begin with?
Sure. So I think a lot of it just stemmed from my own interest in sports growing up. So big into various different sports, played a lot of soccer, played Gaelic football, which is a sport over here in Ireland. When I went to college, started doing some mixed martial arts and some Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And then with all those sports, I was obviously in the gym trying to help my performance and had that aspect of it. And when I went to university first, I started studying biology and physics. And so around that time, I was learning how to read research papers and looking at the literature base of peer-reviewed science and understanding how to be able to interpret this stuff. And so really as a hobby outside of my studies, I was trying to find stuff that might help my performance in these sports and in the gym. And so obviously one component that I kind of fell across was nutrition. And as I started trying to read through some of this research that I was finding, I found that it was maybe a bit different to what maybe a lot of the mainstream messages we hear around nutrition. And actually a lot of different ideas popped up from what I was seeing in research, as opposed to typical beliefs that people might have had, at least around that time, around what constituted a healthy diet and what might be good for athletes. And so I really started at it from that angle of helping my own performance. But what I saw pretty quickly is after learning a bit more and starting to implement some changes was not only improvements in my performance and changes in my body composition, but just how I felt on a day-to-day basis, how healthy I was, my energy levels. And so I was really aware then of just how profound an impact these changes in nutrition had. And so just encouraged me to dig deeper and deeper and deeper. And so I suppose fast forward on another few years from there, I'd graduated with a degree in science education and become a high school teacher in science. But all through that time, I was still fascinated with this subject of nutrition and the science of nutrition, and I continued just to read all that stuff in my own time, to the point where I said, look, if I'm doing so much of this reading of nutritional science, why not just switch and go down this route, because this is what I'm super passionate about. So I decided to quit teaching, went back to college, got my master's degree in nutritional sciences, started writing a bit about nutrition on a blog, started coaching people nearby, and started to kind of get into the practitioner side of things. And then over time, after I'd finished my master's and had built up some coaching clients, then started with my company Sigma Nutrition, and that kind of has grown over the last few years, and now we're thankfully putting out a lot of content around evidence-based nutrition to try and help people, to help general population, to help athletes, to help coaches. And so it's kind of just grown from there. But I think that was the original start of what really got me interested in nutrition, I suppose.
Very cool, man. Very cool. So talking about how you sort of came across a lot of info, and you found that once you started digging a little deeper, that sort of that mainstream media isn't necessarily always true or isn't really factual based. So when we're digging into the ketogenic diet today, can we just start from the very beginning? So what is ketosis?
Sure. So ketosis is essentially a metabolic state in the body where your body starts producing these things called ketone bodies, which can then be going used for fuel. So typically where this would have been seen originally in research would have been looking at models of starvation. So this thing called starvation ketosis, where if you're starved for a prolonged period of time, your body doesn't have any fuel sources that it can continue to use. So you start using up your carbohydrate stores in your muscle and liver. And over time, because your brain still demands glucose, while the rest of your body is okay, like burning up your fat stores and using them, you still require some glucose to fuel the brain. So if you're not eating anything and you don't have these stores, and now your carbohydrate stores are dropping, and you can't continue to do that. So the body has essentially evolved this adaptation where it can start to make this other fuel substrate called ketone bodies, which the brain can now also use. So that thing that I mentioned, just for the reason why this is important is because we can mainly use carbohydrates and fats, which most people hear about. We can also burn up some proteins, amino acids to a certain degree, but that's a much smaller player. And really, if you keep doing that, you're just going to be breaking down muscle protein, for example. So we really have these two things, carbohydrates and fats, that we're going to mainly be burning. But because the brain can't actually run on these fats per se and has that glucose requirement, as an adaptation, the body would have made these ketone bodies to essentially fuel itself. Now, where you would have seen this in practical medical applications would have been they started to notice things in epilepsy, where a ketogenic diet was actually able to help with the amount of seizures that people with epilepsy were having. Now, what a ketogenic diet is, as the name might suggest, is a diet that someone is on that would put them in this metabolic state of ketosis that's not actually starvation. So essentially, it's trying to mimic this same state you get after a prolonged period of starvation, but through the diet. And so how you do that is from a restriction of carbohydrate. So once there is a very little amount of carbohydrate in the diet, your body is eventually going to go into the state of ketosis. Now, it can obviously do that from an extremely, extremely low calorie diet because you're just taking in so little calories. If you continue to do that for a number of days, people can kick into ketosis. But outside of that, what we're seeing now with this emergence of people talking about nutritional ketosis or ketogenic diet or a low carb, high fat diet being ketogenic is you can stay eating a decent amount of food, but essentially you're going into that metabolic state of ketosis by restricting your carbohydrates to a large enough extent. So and the number will differ from person to person depending on how big they are, how active they are, genetics and so on, but on average you could think of if someone is eating, say, less than 30 or 40 grams of carbohydrate per day, over time they're going to go into a state of ketosis. So that's the main thing, and we should probably point out, we might get this later on, that it's mainly down to that restriction of carbohydrate. It is not down to eating lots and lots of fat. So that's one misconception many people have, is that to get into ketosis, you just eat more and more fat, whereas really that's not a part of it at all. The only reason people are on high amounts of fat on a ketogenic diet is because you have to get your calories from somewhere. Really, the ketogenic state is coming from that restriction of carbohydrate.
Awesome. That was a great breakdown. So basically we can get there in one of two ways: restricting carbohydrates enough, or just restricting calories in general enough, right? So you can get there kind of a couple different ways.
Right, and the restriction of calories is going to be an extremely low-calorie diet for someone to be able to do that. So it's just going to be such a low amount of food that by nature the carbohydrate amount is going to be low too, right? So that's the kind of main thing going on. But people can do it with just very, very low-calorie diets, particularly if they're extremely highly active. But the primary way, when most people now are hearing in the news about a ketogenic diet or nutritional ketosis, most people are referring to a diet that is severely restrictive of carbohydrate to enough of an extent where you will eventually go into this metabolic state of ketosis.
Awesome. So let's say someone follows one of these approaches and achieves ketosis. Are there any telltale signs that someone can actually tell that they're in ketosis, or can you test for it? What's up with that?
Yeah, so there is various measures of testing. If someone doesn't have testing, a lot of the kind of common things they may notice fairly soon is sometimes people can actually get the smell of their breath. They'll notice a distinct change in the smell of their breath, and what that actually is one of those ketone bodies, acetone. So one of those ketone bodies has a very distinct smell, and they kind of get this change. But if you're looking at testing, there's a few different ways. One of the probably most cost-effective and very simple ways is something called a keto stick, where you can get these in a pharmacy, where you'd basically go in and you just urinate on the stick, and it's like color-coded, and it'll just change color if you are in ketosis. Now, these are a way of essentially kind of a yes-no kind of binary answer of, is there a certain presence of ketone bodies within your urine? So it's a way of just telling people, yes, there is some ketones here. It's not like super accurate for someone who wants to have exact numbers. For that, you can do things like a blood test. So it'd be the same thing as people that have seen a blood glucose monitor. You can now get ones for ketones, where you do like a pinprick, put it on a strip, and you get a reading in millimolars of how much beta-hydroxybutyrate is in your blood. So that's one of those ketone bodies again. So you might get a reading, and you're looking for that to rise above, say, 0.5. So typically, someone that's on a ketogenic diet will probably have a number of 1 millimolar or more, depending on the time of day and so on. So you can read it through something like that. And then people might also be seeing online, there's a number of commercially available breath monitors now as well, where, again, you just put your breath into this monitor, and it'll give you a reading, typically looking at acetone in the breath to show you if you are in ketosis. So there are a number of ways that people can test to see if they are. But again, it depends on what someone's true purpose of using this type of diet is, how far they need to go down those routes, how much data they actually want to see, and how important it actually is for them to see an actual number. Where the kind of monitoring of the blood is probably most used, and why it's most important is for, say, diabetics, which are trying to monitor it for a different reason because of a dangerous condition called ketoacidosis, which is completely separate, we should say. That's why they might monitor very carefully the amount of ketones in their blood. But for someone that's just doing it for kind of maybe as a weight loss thing for a while, or just trying this diet, they probably don't even need to monitor that intently, as long as everything else is progressing in the right way. But they are the typical ways people can measure.
Awesome. Yeah, it kind of seems like if someone's a more numbers-oriented person, those are the people that get kind of into the numbers, into the actual formal testing. But like Danny said, if you are just doing it for like a fat loss sort of deal, then you probably don't need to go crazy with the testing.
Yeah, for sure.
So nowadays, most folks are interested in a ketogenic diet for fat loss. So is there an actual metabolic advantage to following a ketogenic diet over, say, a mixed diet that includes more carbohydrate but still controls for calories?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that last part that you mentioned is the really important part, one that controls for calories. So if we're looking at purely from a physiological, metabolic perspective, on the evidence that we have right now and of all the high-quality trials that we've seen on this topic right now, if you control two diets for the amount of calories they have and the amount of protein they have, which is another important aspect, if you control for both those things, then the relative amount of carbohydrate and fat in the diet won't change the amount of fat loss that's going to occur in those people. So it's not going to change overall energy balance. So by energy balance, just calories in versus calories out. There's no difference in protein. And so whether that someone is in a ketogenic state or is having slightly more carbohydrate, at least of all the trials we have so far that are set up to try and address this question, it doesn't seem that there's any metabolic or physiological advantage purely for fat loss in those cases. Where it's probably more of an issue, and I'm sure we'll probably get to this, is in the real world and practical examples for a given individual, could this strategy be more useful than something else? And then you could start having a real conversation there, but that's distinct from people trying to say that you have this metabolic advantage, that it causes you to lose more fat because you just start burning more fat and so on, which is kind of another kind of misleading line. So purely from a metabolic perspective, it doesn't seem to be superior for fat loss over a diet that's controlled for the same amount of calories and the same amount of protein.
Amazing. So kind of looping back around, what are some of the most common mistakes or maybe just misconceptions that you see when folks try and implement a ketogenic diet?
So in terms of the implementation of it, of if they want to try and do it but aren't really kind of getting there, probably one of the ones that might be of most interest to people is to be aware of their electrolyte intake. So their intake of things like sodium and potassium and magnesium and so on. Because often people who embark on a ketogenic diet, one of these, at least anecdotal things that you hear from people is this keto flu or low carb flu, basically this kind of slang term for starting on a ketogenic diet for a while and getting these kind of flu-like symptoms of feeling a bit run down, lethargic in that kind of first week or so as they adapt across. And what it seems, at least from kind of people, at least from a physiological perspective, it makes sense because you will be losing more of these electrolytes with that change in carbohydrate intake. But also anecdotally, people who have worked in this realm with people doing ketogenic diets, that you can kind of avoid this ketogenic flu by just making sure you up your amount of added, say, sodium and maybe even potassium, but particularly sodium, like I say, potassium to some degree, magnesium, just the typical electrolytes as you're in that transition phase. So that might be from just a supplement, it might be from adding more salt to meals and so on, and being a bit more wary of that. That can be a real useful strategy from a practical perspective for people. If someone is doing it purely for, they just want to try it and they just want to diet down or lose a bit of body fat, and they're not doing it for, say, a true clinical issue, then one other thing is they get too wrapped up in maybe doing an excessive amount of measurements and being worried about their ketone number and thinking that for more fat loss they need to drive their ketone number higher and higher, which is just not true. So maybe their ketones are elevated, but let's say they go to like 0.8 millimolars. They're in ketosis, but they think, okay, if I really drive this up to 2 millimolar or 3 millimolar, I'll be deeper in ketosis and I'm going to lose more and more body fat. And that's just simply not true, because it's not this state of ketosis that's driving more body fat. As we mentioned earlier, it's for that person to be losing body fat over a prolonged, extended period of time. There needs to be a energy deficit or more energy being expended than coming in. And a ketogenic diet might just be a useful way for some people to do that. So like for some practical reasons, some people just feel like their appetite goes down when they're on a ketogenic diet. For some people, it just eliminates food choices that they typically end up overeating on. So it can be practically useful, but the reason why it's working, say, for fat loss is because it's allowing that person to either eat less calories or just to they're ending up increasing their exercise during a time where their calories are staying the same, but typically because it's reducing their calorie intake. So it's putting them in a calorie deficit by doing this. So trying to just drive up your ketone number and the presence of ketones in your blood more and more and more, thinking that's going to mean more and more fat loss, is just completely incorrect. So they're the two big ones I think people, if they're aware of on the outset, would kind of save a lot of headaches, I think.
Gotcha. And then can you just briefly touch on too, people hear that when they go on a ketogenic diet that they burn more fat for fuel. And, if you take in more fat, you're going to burn more fat for fuel. So can you just kind of parse that out? Because I think people hear that and think that automatically means more fat loss, but that's not necessarily true.
Yeah, I love this question because it's one of my favorite things to talk about, because like you say, it's such a loaded term, and I think a very misleading way that this topic is talked about. Because in one sense, if someone says, so like you said, there's lots of phrases like, if you eat more fat, you burn more fat, or in a ketogenic diet, you're going to burn more fat, or low carb diet, you burn more fat. And to a certain degree, it's true in that if you increase the amount of fat you are consuming, or you go on a ketogenic diet, so you eat less carbs, but now you're eating more fat than before, your degree of fat oxidation has increased. So to generate energy in the body, like we said before, we typically mainly burn carbohydrate and or burn fat in different combinations. So now, if you change that and you eat less carbohydrate and more fat, what actually happens is you get this shift and you actually end up burning more fat, which actually just means that you oxidize more fat to create energy. Now, on the outset, that seems like a really good thing. But one huge takeaway that I try and get people to remember is that burning more fat is not the same thing as losing body fat per se. And that's a hard thing for people to get their head around. But what all you need to remember is that this term burn more fat is just a slang term for increased fat oxidation. And increased fat oxidation means we're taking some of this fat, burning it up in the body to create energy. And so the reason why it doesn't necessarily mean more body fat lost is because let's think about what we're doing. You switch from your typical diet and now you're eating less carbohydrates and high amount of fat. Because the amount of fat you're consuming has gone up, or there's just not enough carbohydrates around, to generate energy, your body's just going to use fat. So it might not necessarily be the body fat that you have, it just could be the fat that you've consumed via the diet, for example. And so how much fat you end up using up and then storing as body fat is still going to come down to overall energy balance. In the same way that if you had a higher amount of carbohydrate but less fat in your diet, but let's say it's the same number of calories, you would probably burn less fat and you would burn more carbohydrate. But because of that, that means less of that carbohydrate gets stored as body fat anyway, so the total storage of energy is the same. So people get kind of worked up on the oxidation rates and the burning of fat and the burning of carbohydrate. But really, just because you could do something to burn more fat doesn't necessarily mean you lose more body fat. As a final example, just to really get the point home for people, let's say you just take a stick of butter first thing in the morning as your meal, and you eat that whole thing, and you've got a ton of calories gone down. You've only consumed dietary fat. So at that time point, if your body needs to use energy, what's it going to start burning to get that? It's not going to start using the stores of carbohydrate you have in your muscle. It's going to start using all this dietary fat that you've just digested and you can now break and is in your bloodstream. So it's going to use up those fatty acids. So now your fat oxidation is super high. So it's nothing to do with losing body fat per se. It's just burning more fat is just a way of saying you're oxidizing more fat this time. And so that's why it's kind of misleading.
Beautiful. Love that breakdown, man. So moving on to exogenous and supplemental ketones, they seem to be beneficial for performance, but I'm curious on your thoughts on them from a health angle. So for example, if someone's eating their regular, say, moderate to high carbohydrate, fairly calorically dense diet, but hears that ketosis is super cool and then decides to supplement with one of the many keto products out on the market, how that might impact their health because we can't have that in a quote-unquote natural state. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. So the first thing I'll say is that much of this is probably just still going to be speculation right now because it's such a under-researched area. So it's obviously a fairly new product that's being looked at. Most of that is being looked at is either being in sports performance, some of it kind of more in, say, some animal trials, and then some in more kind of the medical scene. But purely for health, it's a tough one to piece apart because if we say someone is already eating a really healthy diet and their lifestyle is all in check, is there going to be an added benefit to doing this? I mean, that would depend on what kind of mechanism someone might be proposing as to what effect it's going to have. So number one, it's an extra fuel substrate, so we have to take account of that. So if someone starts using and burning these ketones, that means they're going to be used up for energy in replace of some of the food you've taken in. So again, it's still going to count as something that can potentially add calories to the mix. But apart from that, in terms of health benefits, the short answer is right now I don't know. It could be. I think there's certainly, a lot of research still to be done. There's probably a lot of promising applications for true clinical scenarios. So whether that be in like epilepsy, whether maybe in certain types of cancer, maybe in certain neurodegenerative diseases, we don't know. And I think a lot of that is ongoing now, and I think a lot of those companies are probably trying to do trials as well as independent trials as well. So potentially in those scenarios, for someone who is already healthy and doing great, could you maybe see a benefit for cognitive function? Maybe. I just don't know. Right now, I would, if it was me, there's probably not a scenario where I would go and advise a client or someone who asked me, hey, you should go and on top of this stuff, start buying these keto supplements in order just to get a health benefit from them, because I've no evidence that they're actually going to do anything, so I'm not going to advise that to people. But hey, in a few years' time, if there's a ton of papers showing, look, you get this added boost from them, then I'll happily say that. But right now, there's no evidence to say there is, and my gut feeling is that it's probably unlikely to have a major health impact on top of doing those kind of fundamentals that you already said, of making sure you're sleeping properly, your overall food quality is good, you're exercising, your stress is low, like those things. How much you can benefit from just adding a ketone supplement, I don't know. So right now, I don't typically recommend them, just because I haven't seen any evidence that they're going to do all that much.
Right. Yeah, that's great. And I mean, again, purely speculative because we just don't know. But what is kind of do you think that there might be some just gut feeling potential harm from taking them in a state where maybe your carbohydrates are a little bit higher and the only reason why you're achieving maybe quote unquote ketosis is because of the supplement as opposed to nutritional ketosis?
Yeah, so I mean, potentially for sure. I mean, we just don't know. It hasn't been played out for long enough. My gut feeling would be that I can't imagine it being super harmful. But that said, I don't know for sure. But certainly, like you say, it could lead to, are we now playing around with things where typically we would have an elevation of ketones is when we don't have carbohydrates around. And so our body's kind of getting ready for that metabolic shift. It changes the activation of different enzymes, for example, and downregulates some that are related to carbohydrate metabolism and boosts up others that are going to be useful for, say, fat oxidation and ketone production in a normal scenario. Now what do we do if we have this flood of ketones within the body, but we also have carbohydrates that we need to deal with? Does that have any detrimental effects? At a cellular level, maybe, but maybe not. So I think you're thinking along the right lines. I think it's definitely something for people to be wary of and something we might need to answer. How much of a potential harm it would be, I just don't know. It may not be nothing at all, but something strange could be going on for sure. So that's an interesting one to think about, I think.
Yeah, and just because we just don't know, if you're listening to this and you're someone that maybe likes to err on the side of caution, then just because we don't know, you might want to hold off for a little bit until we do some further research, and then maybe there's no harmful effects. We just don't know at this point. So performance-wise is a whole different story, but we're just kind of talking about the health angle right now. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I completely agree.
Cool, man. So there's also a scenario where someone takes in a exogenous ketone supplement and then actually can inhibit fat loss. So it can actually have sort of a negative, maybe they're taking it in because they think that it burns more fat. Can you sort of touch on how maybe someone might be misled by thinking that and taking a ketone supplement and then actually having the reversal effect of what they're actually after?
Sure. So that's a really important point, and I think it goes back to something I said earlier, where people have this mistaken idea that, if they're in that scenario where they think the higher I drive my blood ketone levels, the more I'll lose body fat. So if they're doing that with a ketogenic diet, they think, okay, I just need to push up this number higher and higher. I mean, more body fat. If they take that same thinking and now apply it to exogenous ketones, you can now drive up your ketone levels with this supplement, but it's not going to do anything in terms of losing body fat, because those, first of all, more ketones in the blood doesn't mean more fat loss. And especially in this scenario where, like you rightly say, ketones are actually anti-lipolytic, meaning they actually prevent some of that release of fat from fat stores. It's just a normal feedback loop within the body. And so a high presence of ketones can actually be anti-lipolytic. And so if we also think about this purely from an energy balance scenario, so again, thinking of our energy in, energy out, and you want to lose body fat, what you're trying to do is not drive up ketones. What you're trying to do is make sure there's more energy expended than is coming in. So now if you have your diet and now you add in this ketone supplement, you just give it an extra fuel substrate. So on top of the carbohydrates you consume or on top of the fat and protein you use, you now have this extra substrate, ketones, that your body can use up for energy as well. So there's more energy available to be used there. So you're actually shifting away from something that's actually going to be useful for fat loss. So yeah, it's completely erroneous to think that, okay, this is my normal diet now on top of that I start supplementing with ketones, that will lead to fat loss because ketones are magical. You're actually doing the opposite. You're adding more of a fuel substrate on top of your diet already, so it's actually having the opposite effect of what you're probably thinking.
Yeah, that's great, man. So we hear the generic term ketogenic diet, but there are clearly a bunch of different ways to implement a ketogenic diet or set one up. So, for example, in a healthful way or maybe a not so healthful way, but in your eyes, what does a well-formulated ketogenic diet look like?
Yeah, this is a great point, because I think, like you say, so often we have these conversations and arguments around macronutrient breakdowns of diets, and a ketogenic diet is healthier than this diet, or this diet's healthier than others. And really, you can't really tell the exact healthfulness of a diet if you're only looking at its macronutrient breakdown. And this goes for whether that's a high-carb, low-fat diet. I could show you a diet that is purely based on all processed foods that are just very low in fat and just high in sugar. That's a high carb, low fat diet. But similarly, I could have you one that's based on lots of vegetables and fruits and oatmeal and so on. That's low in fat and high in carbohydrate. Very different in terms of the health properties of those foods. The same goes with a ketogenic diet. You can put yourself in a ketogenic diet, like we said, as long as you restrict carbohydrates enough. And if you're going to get then most of your calories presumably from fat. So let's just say someone just goes around and starts eating like lots of bacon and slabs of butter and just oil all the time. That's a diet that's going to be pretty low in micronutrients and can be pretty harmful from a health perspective, versus if you look at a ketogenic diet, you can still have the same core principles of healthy eating that I think most people will agree with. So, for example, having vegetables at the kind of base of your diet, you can still include a wide amount of vegetables. There's lots of like very fibrous vegetables that have a very low net carbohydrate count that you can include in a ketogenic diet, so making lots of vegetable matter in there. And then the food sources you select for protein and fat, you can obviously include lots of typical so either fatty sources of protein, so like fatty fish, like mackerel and salmon. You can start including your typical proteins like beef, particularly then things like chicken and turkey, like all the usual unprocessed whole foods in terms of meats that you would get. Combine that with your vegetables. Maybe you have some room for some berries in there. Then you can have nuts and seeds, avocados, olives. All these things fit in, essentially just thinking about the same thing that most typical sensible guidelines go back to: the majority or the base of your diet from minimally processed food sources. And again, you're just picking ones that are going to fit in with that low carbohydrate, more higher fat spectrum. But again, that doesn't mean just because you say a ketogenic diet, it doesn't tell you whether it's healthy or not. So like you say, doing those things in combination then with maybe, like we said earlier, paying attention to electrolyte numbers as well can be super useful. So yeah, go with those food choices, and food quality still matters no matter what diet you're on.
Yeah, man, that's awesome. So it's very, very different eating, butter, bacon, and cheese versus, what you were talking about, a whole foods approach. And what we talked about earlier with, that maybe 30 to 40 gram of carbohydrates per day to still remain in ketosis, you want to load up on maybe leafy green vegetables and maybe a little bit amount of berries, because you want to maximize your micronutrients given that carbohydrate intake right there. So quality, like Danny said, is still very, very important, and that's a well-formulated ketogenic diet versus a not so well-formulated one.
Right, for sure. Totally agree on that, yeah.
So as we start to wind down here, man, I think it's super helpful for folks to get an idea of how you eat on a daily basis. So what are your current goals, and how does a sort of a typical day look for you these days?
Yeah, sure. So this can be fairly variable, but in terms of goals, athletically, compete in powerlifting. So I compete in the 74 kilo weight class. So I guess that's for 163-ish pounds for those that are metrically challenged, let's say. So for that, I typically walk around a bit heavier than that. And so because of that, if I have a meet coming up, I'll be a bit more attentive to the overall calories of my diet. May have to diet down slowly, or maybe even do a weight cut. But typically, most of my nutrition for performance is just related to recovering from powerlifting sessions, which really, as long as I'm getting a correct amount of overall calories, food quality is pretty decent, and I'm consuming enough protein, that's as much as attention I have to pay towards it. There's not the same attention to detail on, say, exact amount of carbohydrates and carbohydrate timing as there would be with some of the, say, MMA athletes I work with who are training 2 or 3 times a day in a sport that's very demanding of carbohydrates. Powerlifting, not so much. We're doing like some heavy lifts with kind of longer rest periods. It's not all that demanding for carbohydrate per session. So typically what my diet looks like is early in the morning, breakfast on days that I'm training or eating more food is typically going to be something like maybe some oatmeal with a scoop of whey protein mixed in there and a large coffee. On days that I'm either not training or just not too pushed by breakfast, I might just skip that altogether and just have some coffee. Then typical meals for lunch and dinner are pretty similar in that I'll try and get some good quality source of protein. So whether that's chicken, turkey, fish, or beef, typically one of those. Try and get some vegetables in there in some combination. It really just depends on the day, what takes my fancy, and I try and keep those rotated as much as I can. And then I'll typically have some sort of carbohydrate with those, which is the same as pretty much what most people are thinking of, potatoes or rice usually. It might be some type of bread, so it could be like a sourdough bread or a chia seed bread or something like that. To go with those, I'm having a sandwich. And then the same thing I only think about after training. Can I get a good quality protein source pretty quickly? And then snacks-wise, it could be anything. Or it could be protein bar, it could be fruit, it could be changes all the time. But really, it's more the principles that I go on, which is the food sources rotating around those. So can I have a distribution of at least 4 high protein meals across the day? Am I fueling enough food overall? And then making sure I can get as a good variety across the week of different vegetables as I can. And I can kind of be flexible with that, in that if there's a certain day where I know I haven't done a good enough job, I can make up for it on another day. It's just one thing where I like to account for that across the week. So I tend to look at my weekly intake of different kind of foods, as opposed to every day I need to hit this type of thing. But yeah, it's not super exciting, man. It's not that crazy. I like some of that stuff, either oats or eggs or something in the morning, and then those typical meals. It's nothing too crazy. And of course, then I just eat the usual nice food that everyone likes. Time to time, get some gelato after training, get some nice dark chocolate, stuff like that. It's all good. So.
Yum. That sounds great. So I think that's really useful for people to know too, that you're not dialing everything in from a daily perspective. So if you have one day where you're a little low on veggies, all good. Like maybe a day later or a couple days later, you catch up on those and you look at it on more of a weekly basis, because I think people can kind of stress themselves out being like, I got to get this amount of veggies in every day and hit my macros and all that sort of stuff. So I think that really helps for people.
Yeah, for sure. We're huge on it with a lot of our coaching as well, of looking at things on a weekly average, whether that's calories, whether that's macronutrients, whether it's body weight, whether it's vegetable intake, whether it's food sources. For most people, particularly if you're a high level athlete with specific goals and you're training 2 or 3 days or 2 or 3 times per day, and you have specific goals for each of those training sessions, you have to fuel accordingly. For the average person trying to be healthy and just get their body composition in check, really looking at things on weekly average is much more useful. And when I talk to people about this concept of flexible dieting, unfortunately, some people have this kind of misconception that flexible dieting and if it fits your macros is the same thing, right? That you just have this set of macros and you just fit whatever food into that as possible. It's nonsense. Really, with flexible dieting, we're talking more a mentality and approach to your diet. So being flexible what you consume is an important part of that. And if you think I can only have these specific foods each day or in this certain order, I need to do this, this, and this, that can be a stress in itself. And so one way to be flexible with that is to say, okay, I'm going to shoot for this, but any given day that changes up or down in terms of my calories or how much vegetables I eat or whatever metric you're looking at, you can account for that on other days across the week. And that way it's a lot easier psychologically to be cool with things.
Yeah, man, that's great. So out of curiosity, have you implemented a ketogenic diet at any point? And if so, what was your experience like?
Yeah, I first did a ketogenic diet. I think it was around 2012. I think the tail end of that. So it was way before the unfortunately all the cool people started doing it. And I could have made a lot of money off it. But yeah, I just did it as a trial because I was interested in doing it. I'd obviously read some stuff. Read Lyle McDonald's book on it. Read some other people who'd been talking about it, but it was nowhere near as popular as it is now, and so really just out of interest to see what would happen. So I did it for I think a total of 13 weeks, and decided to end it mainly because of how it was affecting my training performance. So at the time I was doing quite a lot of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and as people will know, if you've done that sport, it has quite glycolytically demanding, or a high demand for carbohydrate to really kick into that higher gear. And so that's exactly what I was finding, that while I was able to last the duration of all the training sessions pretty much no problem, it was really when there was a high-intensity scramble or something where I needed a real burst of power, just didn't have it, and it was just affecting my performance. And so I tried it just so I'd have some sort of reference point to see, okay, how you would practically do this, what stuff goes on, what are the pros, what are the cons, maybe to give advice to people. Did it for that length of time, and that's pretty much been the extent of doing it. So during that time, I tracked blood markers and stuff like that, and so overall it didn't do anything too dramatically bad health-wise, I guess. And there's certainly things I would do differently if I were to do it again. Some of the stuff we mentioned, for example, looking at the electrolytes, I would pay a lot more closer attention to that than I did earlier on. I would probably make a few different food choice, or be a bit more stringent with the food quality at certain times. I think it's very easy at the outset, just when you're trying to get used to this new macronutrient breakdown, of I'll just pick whatever will help me get there, because it's quite a change. Next time I'd probably be a lot more stringent on the food choices. But yeah, did that and just didn't work out performance-wise, and so that was it.
Yeah, gave it a go, but wasn't a right fit for whatever your goals were.
Yeah, and I think it was just more just for fun and experimentation. It was never going to be a long-term thing. I don't think. I just think from it's just not necessary for most people unless you have a preference for that, right? So if you're doing it for health or for fat loss, if you don't want to eat that way and you find it difficult to stick to that diet, then just know you don't have to. That you can be perfectly healthy and achieve whatever body composition you wish on a diet that has more carbohydrate in that. If that is your preference. And so don't go against your preferences. You can do that fine. However, if you like the idea of a ketogenic diet and you enjoy it and you prefer being on it and you're less hungry, then do it. But I think that's the big thing that I would take away from it, is that it's just one method among many, many, many methods. And once you understand the principles, you can pick whatever one is going to suit you.
Yeah, I love that. It's a tool. The ketogenic diet is a tool. That's awesome, man. So as far as implementing it with people that contact you, I think I heard you on another podcast just say the only time you really implement a ketogenic diet with somebody is if they specifically ask about it. Is that still the case?
Yeah, and that's pretty much still the case. If someone says, look, I want to do this ketogenic diet thing, I'm interested in it, I really want to do it, will you help me? I'll say 100%. Yeah, it's not the diet that I go around touting to everyone, but I mean, if someone wants to do it and they think it might work for them, then I'm happy to show people, here's the way I would go about implementing it. Here's some of the mistakes that can sometimes happen, and talk to them about the stuff we've just talked about today around electrolytes, food sources, some practical stuff that I learned from my experiences doing it, and help them through that. And then they can decide after a while if it's for them or not. But there's no case where someone would come to me and say, okay, I'm looking to lose some body fat. Can you coach me? And then my kind of default being, okay, I'm going to put you on a ketogenic diet, because I just don't think it's necessary. I think we can get them there without being that restrictive of carbohydrate, on a more moderate amount of carbohydrate. It doesn't have to be super high, but it doesn't have to be that low. And we'll just match that to that person's personal preference for different types of foods. And so we can end up with some clients who are on a fairly low carbohydrate intake, but that's purely down because that's the foods they prefer eating. They prefer having eggs and bacon at breakfast, and they prefer having like salmon and cheese with some vegetables at dinner. So they end up on a low carb diet. For other clients we have, they prefer having a nice healthy breakfast of, say, oatmeal and some whey protein, like I mentioned, and having some sweet potato at dinner. So they just end up with more carbohydrate, but not because we're trying to push, you must be high carb, you must be low carb, whatever. So I don't actively tell people to go on it, but if someone wants to, I'm happy to coach them through that too.
Yeah, that's great, man. That's the exact same way I approach it with my clients as well.
Awesome.
So what topics are really exciting you at the moment? Like, what are you nerding out on info-wise? What's getting you up in the morning?
Yeah, man. So in relation to kind of the health sphere, the big one I've been looking at a lot recently is related to like circadian biology. So our circadian rhythms, this idea of chronobiology and chrononutrition, where looking at the different things that are going to influence our circadian rhythms, that not going to affect our circadian rhythms, are going to have on health, how we can maybe do some things that are going to help put us in the healthiest state possible from that perspective. And then there's also this kind of emerging area of research that shows that potentially, at least in some of the kind of peripheral body clocks around our body, they can also be influenced by our meal timing and our nutrient timing. So the main thing that's going to influence, say, the circadian rhythm of your melatonin production that most people talk about is your exposure to light and dark. So when you get that, that's a huge one that I'm very interested in. But this kind of newer area of maybe the times we eat food and eat certain nutrients can also influence these. Now, at the moment, it's still very much just stuck within literature on rodents and very limited amounts in humans. So it's not something I'd actively go and use with people, but it's just something that I find interesting. And just in general, the whole area around circadian biology and sleep cycles and light and dark exposure, all that stuff really intrigues me.
Oh man, that stuff is fascinating. I talked a little bit about that stuff with Jeff Rothschild, and Dan Patti's going to be on the show. Like, it's just, awesome. Man, it's so fascinating. It's so easy to nerd out on that stuff.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah, Jeff is a great guy. Has done some great stuff in the area, and he's very strong on that and looking at kind of meal timing and windows. So he's a great guy. And Dan Patti's one of my favorite people. I talk to Dan semi regularly, and he'll be brilliant to pick his brain on. So smart. And he's really clued in about. He's one of the few guys that I've seen that is legit smart from a researcher perspective, but is keenly aware of how to practically put this in place to help people, and not just help individuals, but like what things can we do to help larger populations of people. So you'll have a great time talking to Dan. Make sure you say hello to him for me.
Yeah, I will, man. And I couldn't agree more. As far as it's pretty rare to find somebody that can, talk about the research, but then also be like, okay, how can we actually use this in everyday life? And Dan just, man, he does a really, really good job of that.
Yeah, he's so good. He just, I think his big thing is understanding of, from the perspective of human behavior. So anything we learn from research, how would we implement this, and how does human behavior dictate this would actually work? So because of the way most humans behave, would they actually do any of these things? And if not, how can we actually make it a case of that? And you see that with a lot of the cool stuff he has up on his site now, of people being able to use technology, but use it to track different data points, and then what you actually do with that. And man, he's just super smart. You could talk to him for a long time.
Yeah, totally, man. Yeah, Jeff and I got into that a little bit, and it's like, okay, well, maybe eating protein. He referenced a study, eating protein and getting some daylight exposure, led to better sleep at night and early onset melatonin secretion and stuff like that. And it's like, okay, but do we move more calories to later at night just because we have a tendency to watch Netflix and snack a little bit towards bedtime? And so it'll be really cool once more of that research comes together and we can learn how to implement it with everyday people in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big thing for me. I've no doubt that at least theoretically, it seems like that's a good idea, right? Eat a high protein breakfast, kind of eat in line with daylight hours, which is kind of Jeff's thing. When it's sunny outside, that's time to be eating, not when it's dark. and to slightly maybe bias towards more calories earlier in the day. That kind of makes sense to me. The big, I think, question mark in terms of recommending it to other people, particularly just the widespread population, is, okay, if we do that, what is the actual knock-on implication of that piece of advice? Is it that everyone goes and does that? Because if it was, then that's fine. I would advise it to everyone. But is it by giving that one piece of advice actually makes everything more difficult to stick to? And now this person can't actually stick to any of the dietary stuff we do because their big issue is they don't like really eating earlier in the day. They prefer having a larger meal in the evening. So we're actually going against that kind of preference and maybe cultural thing that they have. And so we're making it things more difficult to stick to even the basics. So I think if it's a case of people don't have a preference and they've optimized all the fundamentals, then playing around with the timing may have a real good impact. But that's the kind of one drawback I have from actually recommending it to lots of people, is what would actually happen if we give them this piece of advice. So it's kind of a difference between optimal versus general advice for a kind of a large group of people.
Yeah, man. Yeah, so true. It's a balance. It's definitely a balance. So that's amazing, man. I'll link up to, your Sigma Nutrition Radio and all that sort of stuff in the show notes. But is there anywhere else that folks can reach you if they want to learn more about you, read some of your, you have awesome articles on the Sigma site? Where can folks find out more about Danny?
Yeah, so I suppose the best few places to go is number one, just go to sigmanutrition.com. Everything is up there. Podcasts, articles, any services we have, all that type of stuff is there. Second would be, if they're looking for the podcast specifically, they can search pretty much any podcast app. We're on Spotify, we're on iTunes, we're on Stitcher, everything else. So Sigma Nutrition Radio. And then if you're looking for me on social media, just type my name. Should be pretty easy to find. Sigma Nutrition's on Facebook. They can find my personal account on Facebook. Instagram, Danny Lennon _Sigma Nutrition. Should be on Twitter as well, and any of those places, just search me and you can find me, and I'm happy to answer any questions people may have, or just say hello.
Awesome, man. Well, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I know that folks are going to get a ton out of that. The ketogenic diet is such a hot topic right now, and love to have you back on in the future, chat about some other stuff that people would find useful.
Yeah, for sure, man. Thank you so much for having me. Hope people took even one thing away from this. That would be a success. If people take one new thing, that's a good thing. And I'm happy anytime you let me know. We'll do a round two.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much, guys, for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.